Welcome to the new school. I'm pleased you all could make it. I'm going to speak for just a minute and then introduce our partner organization who helped organize this, and then we'll go straight to the panel and we'll finish up right at 10:15 is the plan. I'm Andrew White. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is an institute within the Milano School of Management and Urban Policy. So Milano is committed to the fields of urban policy and management, and we have degree programs, master's degrees and doctoral degree programs in all kinds of areas ranging from urban policy analysis and management to environmental sustainability, public finance, and so on. Our students and alumni include policymakers, nonprofit leaders, labor and community activists, and public and private sector executives, among other things. The institute that I lead focuses on public policies and their impact on working class and low-income families with children. So we do applied research on public education and child welfare, juvenile justice, and a number of other issues. And while that's not our sole focus, it encompasses most of our work. So, why are we talking about pensions and retirement? It's a bit off track for when you just have a research program focused on children and families. But in fact, this is the second event this spring on this topic here, second event in just over a month. In May, we had Andy Stern and a few others here to talk about retirement security in New York and the nation. They talked about the difficulty of preparing workers for retirement in an era when most people switch jobs repeatedly throughout their adult lives. And to complicate things further, we live in a time when a growing number of people are self-employed. And for obvious reasons, the reason this matters to our work is that many of those folks are parents. It seems to me that all social policy leads back to the question of how best to achieve income security across a person's lifespan and whether government should provide it or not, and when there's no other option. And if you look back in history, kids worked at a young age, older people lived in dire poverty because there was no assurance of government support. And in the United States, this hasn't been true for some time. Susan Lerner, who directs Common Cause New York and helped to organize this event, has a wonderful piece in Newsday yesterday that speaks exactly to that point, and there's copies of it out on the table. So I encourage you to pick it up. A very high percentage of Americans now depend on retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs that they must manage themselves. And often they're managing them as amateur investors, and they're prone to make bad decisions, selling when stocks go down, buying when they go up, exactly the wrong way to go. So it's a private system, and it's unfortunately often an inefficient system. Meanwhile, the conventional wisdom right now among opinion makers and increasingly among political leaders is that the public employee retirement system is also inefficient and expensive and underfunded. So for any elected executive who's trying to manage a budget in this post-recession period, pension funds have also become budget busters, especially this year. It's largely because taxpayers are now making payments to cover for money that the pension funds should have earned over the last decade but didn't, thanks to the financial collapse of 2009. So we're here today to learn a bit more about the contested ground of public pensions in the context of the larger question of retirement security for working people across the country and in New York. We titled this, "What's the Real Story?" In fact, as you're going to see, there are several very different views about what is the real story. And I'm hoping we'll come away with this not with any one answer, but a lot of deeper knowledge about some of the different perspectives and how to make up your own minds about this. We organized the forum along with Common Cause New York, which is dedicated to clean elections and ethics in government, as well as an informed electorate. In a moment, we're going to bring up our moderator and introduce the panel. And while you're listening to the speakers, take a few minutes to write out questions on those note cards that you picked up. If you haven't picked any up, we can pass out more. But the way we're going to do questions for today is to take your questions on note cards. You'll pass them to the end, and people will pick them up, and we'll get them to the moderator. Please put your name and organization on the note card if you can. So I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, Susan Lerner.
Thank you, Andrew. And before I begin, I'd like to thank you and the center and your staff. You have been wonderful and thoughtful partners to work with in putting this panel together. So welcome to Public Pensions, What's the Real Story? The first and what Common Cause New York hopes will be a series of conversations that we co-sponsor with different organizations, featuring prominent civic leaders and authors discussing current issues in a format designed to provide information you can't get in 30-second or even 2-minute sound bites. In planning this program, I was frequently asked whether Common Cause has a position on public pensions or whether we're going to work on that issue substantively. It's a short answer, no. Whatever my personal feelings, as represented in the op-ed that was in Newsday yesterday, are Common Cause has no official position on public pensions, and we're not likely to work on the issue in the future. So why a panel on public pensions when we're a good government group? What we do work on and are very concerned with is the quality of our civic discourse. What, if anything, to do regarding our pension system and public pensions in particular is a topic that's generated a lot of controversy, marked by sharply contrasting views, as Andrew pointed out, so sharply contrasting that there isn't always agreement on whether there actually is a problem. Discussions about pensions can be very confusing, often full of technical terms, defined benefit terms, 401ks, unfunded liabilities, the list goes on. And it seemed to us it's relatively easy to read or hear a particular viewpoint about pensions. In fact, all of our panelists this morning have written wonderful op-eds, magazine pieces, blog posts articulating their position regarding public pensions. And many of them have, in the past few months, participated in programs here in New York City, often where they are the sole or the featured speaker, often speaking to sympathetic audiences, explaining their approach to the issue. What it seemed to us it's harder to find are opportunities to hear more than one viewpoint, particularly in dialogue with each other. Because at the end of the day, that's what civic discourse needs to be, a dialogue between contrasting viewpoints that allow us to weigh the different arguments and try to arrive at our own informed opinion of what the approach should be and what we each think our leaders and our government should be doing about the issue. Common Cause's tagline is holding power accountable. We can't hold anyone accountable if we don't know what we think they ought to be doing. Pensions are a good place to start our series, not only because it's a highly contentious issue, but because unlike property taxes or rent control, charter schools, or transit policy, it has a universality that really very few other issues have. It's in the nature of things that we will all grow old. Many, if not most of us, will reach a point at which we can no longer work. How we deal with public pensions will reflect how we feel about government and will reflect the values that we as a society think are important in dealing with old age. And that has ramifications for everyone. That's why I'm particularly pleased to introduce our moderator this morning, Errol Lewis. Errol is the host of Inside City Hall, a program about New York politics that airs nightly on New York One, and was formerly a columnist and editorial board member at the New York Daily News. And I can't think of anyone more capable of helping us achieve our goal of an engaging and enlightening discussion this morning. Errol, thanks for being our moderator.
Thank you very much, Susan, and good morning to everybody. We've got plenty of time, so we're going to have a good discussion here. And I want to say good morning to Councilman Robert Jackson. I've come to a lot of panels here, and I don't know if I remember the last time I saw an elected official decide to think through some of these tough issues with us. So good morning. We're going to keep this as conversational as possible. My role is going to mostly be to sort of throw some questions in, keep the conversation moving, help field the questions, and make sure that we don't get lost in the weeds on details that may not be clear to everyone. So that you know this is being videotaped, so this is for a much larger audience than the folks who are here today. Well, you have descriptions of who our esteemed panelists are. They all have multiple titles, so I'll give the very short version, the sort of the top line description of who they are, and then we'll get right into the discussion. And from your left to right, I'll introduce them. Richard Ravitch, the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of New York and the former CEO and chairman of the MTA. Next to him is Michael Mulgrew, who is the president of the United Federation of Teachers and is also a former instructor himself. Next to him is E.J. McMahon, who has been writing about this stuff for a long, long time. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and director of research for the Public Policy Institute, which is the research arm of the Business Council of New York State. And next to him is Ross Eisenbrey. He is the vice president of the Economic Policy Institute, and he is the former commissioner of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. And I'm very glad that we're going to have all of these views here. Now, I'm going to invite you, what we'll do is ask you, we'll go right down the line in the order I just introduced you, and ask you to give the 3-minute version of what's the real story with a public pension. As Susan and Andrew have pointed out, this is something that is not just taking up a lot of airtime and a lot of headlines, a lot of space in the newspaper, but is actually an issue of great concern. My own biographical connection to this, I should point out, is that my wife is a state employee and has been for a long time, and she has a defined benefit. She's in a pension program, and we do, in fact, count down the months till when she's going to max out. I am in a defined contribution program, also known as a 401k, and my former employer stopped matching it at one point, and that was kind of disappointing. And then the crash of 2008 happened, and that was really disappointing. And I am trying to sort this out just like everybody else. So with that, let me invite you to tell us what's the real story, Dick Ravitch.
Actually, there are a number of components to a serious discussion about pensions, and I'm going to try to list what they are because it's unfair to try to understand everything about pensions in the public debate without appreciating all the issues that it really raises. Number one, the issue is obviously more on people's minds today because of the deficits that state and city governments face and that are growing given the circumstances with which most of you are familiar. So that has elevated this discussion to be an important part of debates about budgets, where you cut, how do you balance increasing revenues through taxes versus increasing benefits to public employees. So you can't lose sight of that context. To look at this issue as if the world was as it was 20 years ago with respect to the perceived availability of public resources is a terrible mistake. Number two, it is important to have a judgment, and there's no absolute scientific way of measuring this, but it's important to have a judgment about how important retirement benefits are to induce talented people to go into public service versus doing other things with their lives. How important are the retirement benefits to a young man who becomes a police officer and puts his life on the line in the public, or for somebody who goes to work as a teacher in a public school system, particularly with all the uncertainties and public attacks that occur today? How important is the retirement benefits to that decision-making process? And those people who exhibit more rectitude than perhaps appreciation for the fact that a lot of people do, despite the high unemployment in this country, do have professional options to make. And actually, it's interesting to note that there are more people with a college education, a higher percentage of the public employees have a higher education, a higher degree than people who are employed in the private sector. Another fact you have to take into account realistically is the politics of labor unions, both collectively, where their clout is and how they exercise it, particularly in those jurisdictions where unions are a major, major political factor because of the contributions they make and because of their activity in elections. And you have to realize again that these pension systems have been in place for some time. But the truth of the matter is, as late as 1970, the number of of private wage earners in the United States that belong to unions was greater than the number of public employees who are represented by unions, and now the number has dramatically changed, so less than 10% of wage earners in the private sector belong to unions, and that's changed the dynamics within the labor movement and affected enormously how the labor movement impacts on domestic politics. Last of all, in terms of identifying the issues, which I thought was a good way of beginning, there is a serious public debate on the adequacy of the funding of existing plans. And there are people who have real incentives, political, if you want to call it that, policy considerations that influences their judgment as to how you calculate the adequacy of the funding of pension plans. Actuaries and economists often disagree about this, and in some respects it's like arguing about how many angels fit on the edge, on the head of a pin. But on the other hand, there have been discount rates assumed to value current liabilities that, in my judgment, are totally unrealistic. They're based on assumed rates of return that are arguably not going to be realized in the future. But the consequences of that conservative judgment is that the contributions that state and local budgets would have to make to the pension funds of their employees would have to go up significantly. And that is something that people don't like to do when they're cutting budgets and where the choices or the alternative ways of dealing with deficits affects public employees in a totally different way. It affects whether they'll have jobs or not, what their compensation might, what their salaries might be. And these are very tough trade-offs, and this is very poorly understood by the public. But it's a very, very important issue, and there's a great disservice being made to take assumptions about, in my view at least, about rates of return that are unrealistic. And to the extent that people have advocated that in politics, they are really doing a disservice to the public employees who may find themselves at some point in the future that government doesn't have, or these pension funds don't have adequate resources to meet their obligations. There are a number of jurisdictions in this country that are very close to that point right now. And last of all, let me point out that whereas it is probably clear, in my view at least, under the law that the obligation to make the pension payments that were promised is an inviolate obligation. The issue is going to be litigated extensively all over this country in the next 5 to 10 years as to whether or not pension benefits can be modified during the course of an individual's public employment. That, of course, is aimed at the issue of what the cost, the current budgetary cost, is going to be. And that's a fascinating set of legal issues, and ultimately what one's individual value judgment is about the promises of government is separate from the way the courts are going to ultimately advocate it. Anyway, I think those are the separate issues that constitute the subject of pensions.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out and listening to this fascinating conversation. I'm sure it's going to get quite interesting at times. From my perspective, when people bring up pensions, my first thought is always, how are we, not just my members, but how are we as a society going to make sure that we have something for people to have retirement security, economic retirement security? That is the question that I think we're dealing with when we're talking about pensions. Are we going to move forward as a country and continue to remove retirement security from people, which we know in the end will cause a bigger economic burden upon our municipalities? And that's the real fundamental question that we're talking about. And the debate is, how do we get there? How do we allow, how do we create a system that ensures that Americans will have retirement security at one point in their life. Because if we don't have that, then what are we really talking about? Everyone should work until the day they die. And I don't think that's acceptable to anybody. Now, New York City, I can talk about my pensions. The average New York City teacher starts work at 21. They retire at the age of 60. They now pay almost 5% of their salary for 27 years. The average New York City teacher pension is now $42,000. These are things that we have bargained for. In order to have that benefit, they have given up salary. So when people say we don't pay for our pensions, it's clearly one of the myths that I hear continually out there. People do contribute into their pensions. People have given up salaries in lieu of having the benefit. So the idea that you hear that public employees are getting a free ride is clearly people trying to mislead what the actual facts of the debate are. Now, why right now we have these escalated costs at this moment, you're going to hear a lot about in this discussion. We know a lot of it has to do with what happened with the market in 2008. And therein lies the part of, well, are these contributions for the municipalities going to continue? And I'll say they are not, and other people on this panel will say they will. The idea of 401k plans, it's something that should be discussed, but right now, because of what happened in 2008, we have reports 45% of baby boomers are going to run out of their funds, their retirement funds, and then what are they supposed to do at that point? So these are really tough issues. But the debate, as far as I'm concerned, people will try to split one sector against another. The debate really should be centered upon how are we as a society going to ensure that people have stability and security in their retirement. And that's really what this debate is about. It's really a debate about values we have as a country. And there's a lot of politics involved, a lot of motivation for people to make money in all sorts of different ways. And I like to put that all right out on the table and say, let's have a discussion about it. But in the end, what we're always trying to solve for is how we can ensure that people have that security, which I believe every person has a right to. And just because some people have had it taken away from them, that is not a good argument to say take it away from more. In fact, it should be the exact opposite. And people are more mobile now. And people on this panel aren't going to like things that I say. I think we should be looking at some sort of a national pension plan because people are more mobile. And that could come up. That's going to be very difficult to work out, but I think it's something we can work out as a country. And using these funds to move things forward, using pension funds to move infrastructure projects, different things forward, because there are different obligations that we need to do on pension funds that don't limit us because it's long-term in terms of investment, versus now with the financial industries needing quicker turnover, they are more reluctant to do long-term investment. So there's all sorts of room to really move forward on this debate. But the politics are really what is driving the debate right now at this moment. And the politics, as you know, are based on people's political needs. And I will always go back off of that and say, what are we going to do for the majority of Americans? We need to have more economic security in retirement, not less. And that's where I want this. That's where I will continually push this debate. Thank you.
Well, it's funny. I was under the impression we already had a national pension plan, but perhaps you can educate me on that.
If you
as for the real story on public sector pensions, I would boil it down to this. It can be summarized in two parts. One is the stark difference between public sector retirement plans and those in the private sector. Public sector employees can retire at younger ages with more generous benefits, usually significantly more generous benefits than those in the private sector. That is the case now and has been the case for a long time. Secondly, All public pension plans, without exception, systematically, significantly understate the true cost and value of their benefits. All public pension plans, without exception, are underfunded using fair market value standards prevalent in the private sector. These are not political statements. These are factual statements supported by, among others, the Congressional Budget Office. And the problem with current public sector defined benefit plans is that they generally shield, especially in states like New York with the constitutional provision we have, they completely shield their members from any financial risk at the cost of creating enormous, compounded, open-ended financial risk for taxpayers, which generally strike and explode, result in exploding costs at the moments when taxpayers can least afford it. And so in the last decade, we've seen New York City's annual employer pension contribution rise from just over $1 billion to next year $8.4 billion. That is going to crowd out and starve a lot of services, including services for the working families and poor children that are the focus of this program at this school. And the question is, can we afford to have a system that works that way? I would say the answer is no, and that there are worthy alternatives that involve different forms of retirement planning and retirement security, a measure of retirement security for public employees that we should be looking at and discussing. And so that's where I would begin a discussion.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I want to look at this a little differently. I want to look at it from the point of view of all of us being the employers of the public employees. And the question is, what do you want your retirement benefit to do for you and for your employees? And so the first thing that you want to look at is, are your employees overpaid? And if they're not, then why would you start looking at cutting any part of their compensation package? You know, so the first question that you have to answer, and I think that it's clear across the country. My institute has done studies, and others have, that public employees generally are slightly undercompensated compared to the public to the private sector. So, just as a general matter, there would be no reason to look to make cuts in their compensation anywhere, including in their retirement pay. As an employer, what are you looking for? You're looking for a way to attract, as a couple of the speakers have said, attract good talent and retain it. You have a real problem in the public sector as an employer retaining talented people, especially the best educated people, because by and large, where the private sector pays better is in the places, technical employees, professional employees, lawyers. How do you keep a lawyer who is going to represent you against GE when they're polluting the Hudson River? How are you going to keep somebody with experience and talent for 20 or 30 years when they could move to the private sector and make 3 or 4 times as much? The way you do that is by having a good pension plan that assures them retirement security at the end of their life. So you've heard one fairly astonishing statement here, that every pension plan in the country is underfunded, and that there's no question about that. I just want to make sure you understand that there's definitely a question about that. There's a huge issue about between economists and actuaries about how pension plans should be funded, and EJ is taking a view that I think is, a wonderful view for economists and theoreticians, but has very little to do with your job as the employer and as a budgeter, trying to figure out what your costs are going to be for your retirees, your employees when they retire. Your job is to figure out how much money to set aside, figure out how much that money will earn, and will it be enough to pay all the benefits you've promised. The actuarial assumptions that the New York state plans generally use and might be might be a little high. I mean, it might be that 8%. No, and this is an important question. Over history, they have made, even including this 75-year worst incident in 3/4 of a century, even including this, if you look back over the last 25 or 30 years, the plans have met their actuarial assumption. So, right now you're in an extraordinary period. People forget that we are in an economic crisis in the country where, because of not what public employees did, but what the private sector financial gurus did, we lost $14 trillion of national wealth. We have an unemployment rate that is, a real crisis. The public employee pensions are not a crisis right now compared to the jobs crisis of having 14 million people unemployed and another 10 million people underemployed. But there is a legitimate question. Can we make what we've done in the past, can we meet those returns on investment on our plans going forward? Maybe it's not an 8%. Maybe it's 7% is a better estimate. But if you overestimate, you have a real problem. If you underestimate, you also have a problem, because you're taxing people and cutting public services to meet something that's going to happen 30 years from now, a responsibility 30 years from now. And if you are setting aside way too much money, then you're depriving children of their education, you're providing people of public services they need now, and you end up with a surplus later on that you don't want. So the economists' assumptions about what the discount rate should be, it's a very different matter from the actuarial question of how much money do you need to set aside now to meet the promises that you have in the future.
But, that is a great place to start the discussion then, because there are a lot of moving parts. There are actuarial assumptions about how long people are going to live, how long people are going to be in the workforce. There are laws and regulations that govern a lot of this stuff, and then there are the underlying economic assumptions, which are a whole other bag of guesses. But I know you wanted to say something about that, too.
Yeah, I was going to make the point you just made, Errol, but also, with all respect, the average increase in value in the stock market over the last 50 years was 7%. If you assume that 75% of a pension fund is going to be invested in equities and 25% in debt, and you take the corporate bond rate to represent what you would return on the 25% that's invested in debt, that brings you to an average a lot closer to 6. So using 7 3/4 and 8 is unrealistic in my judgment. Second of all, if you believe, as I do, that these obligations to pay benefits are inviolate, that what the laws and constitutions in most states promise are enforceable promises, then if I were responsible as a representative of the taxpayers to administer these funds and to enact budgets, I would want to invest it conservatively to make sure that I would not impose upon a future generation of taxpayer the risk that they won't have enough money to make the benefits payments in the future. If I believed that those, which I personally do, that those obligations are inviolate. And that's really the issue here. It's really what you can argue, as I said before, about what is proper. It isn't a question of propriety. It's how much of the risk of paying future benefits you want to allocate to future generations. And I have seen in so many respects in this society the benefits that my generation has enjoyed from this unbelievable democracy that we live in, and the extent to which so much of the cost of that has been pushed forward on my grandchildren's generation, and I don't like it.
EJ, is that what you mean by public pensions are underfunded?
Well,
We're pushing the cost forward?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'll use the basis, one of the many sources for my astonishing statement was a recent report by the Congressional Budget Office. I'll read it word for word to you. By any measure, nearly all state and local pension plans are underfunded, which means that the value of the plan's assets is less than their accrued pension liabilities for current workers and retirees. Now, we've been talking about the discount rate. We probably ought to explain what that means. To use a homespun example, let's say I promise you, each and every one of you, depending on your age, that when you retire, which say the median age in this room is, say, 40, so let's say 20 years. To be moderate, it really probably be more like 25 years. I've absolutely promised you I'm going to give you a sum of money every year starting when you retire. Not only do I absolutely promise you, the state constitution absolutely requires that that money be sent to you in monthly checks commencing with your retirement, no matter what happens. I must pay you that money. How much money do I need to be putting aside to be absolutely sure of making good on my obligation to you? You don't even have to think of it as a pension. Think of it as a debt, okay? Now, what if I was to say to you, well, I'm not actually going to put away too much, but I'm going to buy a lot of lottery tickets over the next few years, and the odds are I'm going to do well. Now, that would be extreme example. That's obviously extreme. How about if I said to you, I've got a friend named Bernie who never fails to make, year in and year out, I don't know how he does it, he makes 10% a year, I'm going to give him the money. How about I say, you know, I think that, you know, over the last 60 years, a portfolio weighted 70% to domestic and international equities has earned maybe 7.5% to 8% a year. I think I'll invest in all those stocks. And that way, I'll be absolutely positive to have the money and will be at no risk of having to pay. Well, wait a minute. Will I be, you know, you're going to get it no matter what. You don't have anything to worry about. I have to pay this. If I don't have the money, I have to take money from my children, my family, my plans to pay you. If I want to be certain of having that money, I'm going to invest it in a way that has a lower risk. If I invest it at a higher risk, I need to be aware that there's a difference between in those spreads between what I would be paid for investing in something with a lower risk and something at a higher risk. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the discount rate here. And it was interesting because it was said earlier that the economist discussion about discount rates is interesting, but it's a very different question from what you need from the question of what you need to set aside now. And I would say, with respect, that's exactly the question. That's exactly the question. The exact question is, what do we set aside now, and are we setting aside enough? Our efforts to scramble and dig our way out of a very deep hole, which, by the way, was not dug overnight in the fall of 2008, goes back further than that. Our efforts to dig out of that hole, that question is, how much do we need to put aside? And the answer is, the number is on its way towards something around $10 billion in a few years, depending on things we can't predict. That's the problem with this system is at the back end, for the recipient of a risk-free benefit, a benefit that is risk-free to the recipient, we're making risky investments. And in order to get from point A to point B, we have an extremely complicated system, lots of moving parts, very opaque, very difficult to understand, and very prone to random, variable events, which is what life is and what financial markets are. They become more volatile in recent years, and exposing the taxpayers to outsized risks. So to sum it up one other way, the principal financial benefit of a large central pooled retirement fund that has hundreds of thousands of people in it is that it creates a great degree of efficiency. The largest benefits, all of the action is pooled to deliver the largest benefit to the lifer or to the long-term worker, to the disadvantage of the short-term or interim worker, by the way. What that does, but that benefit is offset by this very significant, among other things, this significant compounding of the risk. The taxpayers of New York City, the people of New York City who depend on city services, are the ones who are paying, and last but not least, Mike Mulgrew's members are the people who are paying right now for the fact that the city's pension contribution has gone up from just over $1 billion a decade ago to $8.4 billion next year. Think about that figure. You're going to be spending $8.4 billion next year to keep up with what you owe the pension fund. And by common private sector financial standards using fair market values, it's not enough. As of the end of fiscal 2009, none of the city's pension funds were 50% funded using fair market value, as reported by the city's own actuary in alternative measurements in each of the comprehensive financial reports.
You know, I have to add one fast thing. To state the issue in another way, for, again, not to be argumentative about it, but
That's okay.
if you, no.
I think it's
if
going
you-
there sooner or later, Dick.
Yeah.
Mike, the fact of the matter is that the actuary for the New York State Employees Retirement System wrote a report, and he said if you used a 6% discount rate instead of the 8% that they've been using, it would require an additional pension contribution this year of between $2 and $3 billion. Now tell me, $2 or $3 billion is between 20 and 30% of what the governor and the legislature say they reduce spending by at the state level. If you added $2 or $3 billion to that, if you'd use that conservative number which EJ advocates, you would have added that amount of expenditure to the state budget. So what you really, I respectfully suggest is that the question is this generation of taxpayers prepared to fund the pension funds adequately? That's my view, that they should. I don't want to push the risk on another generation. That's the difference. How much are the taxpayers going to pay to make these benefits payable out of the pension fund instead of out of subsequent budgets of the governing of the state or the city, as the case may be? That's the issue, not whether it's a good thing to have pensions or not.
When we negotiate, we give up things for benefits. So the idea that, oh, should we be paying it? Well, there was a contract reached where these benefits were agreed upon, first. Second, to dismiss 2008 like it was a nothing. We had, let's go buy the lottery tickets, and I know somebody named Bernie going on right down in this borough. Let's be very clear here. And we have reports that 50% of the current liability is specifically because of that event. So that is why we are dealing with a spike right now. That spike will, this year, the pension funds are producing at almost 20%. So we know that that cost will start to drop again. In New York State, unlike other states, we have been very responsible in our pension fund in making sure that it is properly being administered to. We are dealing with an issue right now specifically because of 2008. And we'll get into certain things that I think should be changed. The idea that there was fraud committed upon these pension funds and we do not have a right as individual organizations to go get that money back is going to be part of this discussion also today. But to continue to say that these costs will always be escalating and say we cannot say by any means because there's no control over the future. No, there isn't control over the future. But this is why we have people, actuaries, looking at what is the performance, what is the right thing to do. There are other states and municipalities who have not done a very good job, and that's me trying to be nice, about what were their responsibilities in administering to these funds. And that we need to make sure that across this country, people are doing this work responsibly because the system can work. And it does work. But to say that to put out the idea that these costs are going to continue to escalate is absolutely not true. We know the last 3 years, what the pension funds have been producing, the costs will come back down. I don't know if we might not have another one of the largest frauds and criminal acts put upon us again. Maybe it will happen down in Wall Street and the financial institutions. I'm sure they'll try to figure it out. And if that does happen, we'll be here talking about it again. But let's be clear. These benefits are done through negotiations. We pay for part of our benefits. These were done in lieu of salary increases. We are not private sector. Private sector gets earnings in other ways. But at the same time, to me, as I said in my opening statement, the bigger problem and real crisis we're facing is I am worried that we are going to have generation after generation without real retirement security, and that economic burden upon all of us will truly be the crisis that we would face.
Ross.
So I just want to show you a couple of charts here that will help you understand what happened recently. And it answers something that EJ said. He's given you this picture of a huge swing from $1 billion contribution, more or less, to $8 billion, and how terrible this is. Well, partly that's because people in New York went through this period where you used to have city contributions up here as a percent of salary, and they fell down for one of the plans almost to zero because the economy was doing great, the stock market was doing great, and you all benefited by your government making a bad decision not to make the long-term contribution steadily. Instead of doing that, they said, oh, well, you know, the stock market's putting extra money in the plan. We don't need to make the contribution. So if you live, you know, sort of free for a while, think, you know, you're going to have to pay eventually, and that's what happened when the, you know, now that the market has crashed, you're going to have to put more money in. But the city comptroller has just issued a report because of changes that have been negotiated.
Thanks.
The contributions over time, this is projected city pension contributions in real dollars. You can see it spiked up. Over time, it's going to fall. That using, even using a 7% discount rate, this lower expectation of what the plan is going to, what the plans are going to earn, the comptroller projects that that your plans are sustainable over time, and in fact that the contributions are going to fall. So, you know, there really isn't a crisis in New York plans beyond. Don't forget, we have been through a cataclysmic economic event, the worst recession in 75 years, and you know, you have to expect that there's, you know, there will be effects.
Let me ask a question to everybody at the table then. If Dick Ravitch is right, and the discount rate, the amount that should be set aside, or the assumption of return should be closer to 6% than 8%, and that what sounds like a small percentage difference actually amounts to billions of dollars in current budget dollars, which would really sort of trigger a kind of a crisis. Do we have the right people and institutions and the right forums for conversation to resolve this in a way that will be rational? Because from years of covering politics, I've yet to meet a politician who wouldn't jump at the opportunity to save current dollars, push the problem into the future and say, the market will come back, we'll stop the fraud, something will happen, you know, the technology will bring about some great boon, some other way of pushing the problem off into the future. I mean, it's human nature, it's the nature of our political system. Are we able to get our arms around this with what we have now, or do we need something new?
Well, you know, that's the right question. Obviously, I don't think the political system is responding adequately to the growing disparity between the cost of the commitments that we made as a society, and in my view, and I agree with Mike to the extent that I think the obligations that we incurred to public employees are things we have to honor, that the gap, which is growing rapidly between the cost of those obligations and the resources, we've talked about everything except the resources. And I remind people that what I personally think the most disastrous public decision that was made in the last 30 years in the United States was the Bush tax cuts. And all I'm saying is that you have a choice. You're going to have to tax people in order to make these pensions, in my view, soundly financed. And I don't blame a union leader for saying, I don't want to see budget spending because I know the politicians aren't going to impose more taxes, no matter what party they're in. Everybody's against taxes. So therefore, if we can avoid spending more money on pensions, let's do so, whatever the rationale may be. I don't blame that when the cost of cutting other government expenditures rather than taxes will come out of the hides of the very same people who are exposed to greater risk on the ultimate payment of their pensions.
2.5 years ago, my union made a pension modification, and it's saving the city over $100 million a year. The day we made it, it was announced, and it was never spoken of again. And that shows you the political climate, which you're talking about. We're always willing to go into a conversation if it's going to be constructive. And if we take a position, we would try to move it politically. That means going up, lobbying, advocating, and doing what needs to be done. It's hard to get that conversation to take place because it does become very political at times, and it gets heated, and there's a lot of mistrust. But I do believe it can happen. I do believe it can happen, but it has to be based on facts and numbers. And as we all know, facts and numbers are pretty hard to come by, depending on who's bringing them to the table. But I think you can put groups together who will have these conversations, which is why we made our modification. We did it openly. We did it openly. There was no great pressure upon us. We said, this is something that sounds right, needs to be done, and we went and did it. And we went to Albany together with the city of New York to have it passed. So these conversations can happen. But you see that this struggle, as Dick was just alluding to, is, how do you increase revenue? And I'm going to keep going back to retirement security. You don't want to increase revenue. You have a problem right now where you need revenue to meet these obligations. The people most at risk are the ones who absolutely have to have the retirement security. So we talk about a millionaire's tax. People get very upset when we talk about it. I don't really mind talking about a millionaire's tax here in New York State. We're sitting in the middle of the income disparity city of the entire country. We lead the country in income disparity. And I believe we've seen the tax burden shift more and more onto the municipalities, which is why when you're saying more revenue out of people who are already being stressed economically, yet those on top are not being stressed economically, then this is the time to do this, to do this right now so that we can move forward. Pensions obligations will go down by a combination of things. One, they will recover from what happened in 2008, and two, there have been a lot of changes, and as they kick in, that lowers the liability to the municipality.
So Michael, you mentioned that your union, working with the city, arguably saved us $100 million.
Well, even the city will admit we're saving
Okay,
$100 million
I don't doubt the number, but the way
Believe it or not,
the way
they'll
you
say
said
it.
you said it was announced and it was never spoken of again. It makes it sound as if the incentive system for people like yourself, and you are elected by your members,
Yes.
you've got to keep some people happy, and the incentives for other elected officials on the government side is maybe not what it should be. That people can always get a headline by having a press conference and sort of bang it on the table, but something like this, it doesn't sound like the public maybe is aware enough of what's going on here?
I don't think the political climate right now is to say, oh, a union did something that's saving money for the city. They'd rather say, what else are you going to give us? You hear this constantly. That's what it's so charged with political rhetoric, and people have agendas versus what's really best. And that is something we constantly struggle with. And we'll continue to struggle with that. But if cooler heads prevail, good things happen. And I can give you assurances from myself that I'm always looking for those opportunities, because it is a balance between we might be the employees, but we're also the taxpayer. We want to do what's right. We want our city to thrive. We want our state to thrive. That makes it better for our employees. We're concerned with the schools, obviously. It makes it better for our school system. So we're also dealing with the balance.
Well, now, Mike, you're referring to the retirement change you're referring to is the 25 years, the 25-year plan at 57?
and we dropped an assumption from 8.25 to 7 on our TDA.
Right.
Okay.
In other words, they have a.
Let's take a minute to decode that
Well,
for those who were not
let's
at the
do- Do
negotiation.
you want to explain what the TDA is? Or do you wanna do-
No, I don't need to know what the
No,
TDA
but
is, but what you are talking about is retirement at 57 instead of what, 55?
55. It went from, yes, to
And
57.
you're also talking about changing the discount rate that we've thrown out here a couple of times to not assume 8% return, but assume 7.5% return.
On a different fund,
There's.
sorry.
Correct me if I'm
Leave it
wrong.
at that.
Teachers have you can voluntarily invest your own money,
Mm-hmm.
it's added savings, in a tax-deferred annuity.
Yes, it's, I mean, a lot of people in the city do it. I know half the households in the city are now living below the poverty line. You know, living on $42,000 in New York City, it's a bit of a stretch.
Well, but I mean, the tax-deferred annuity, just so you understand, if you are someone in here is in the private sector, let me explain this, okay? You have an annuity you can invest in that has a guaranteed rate of return. That was 8% and now has been reduced to 7%. That's the significant concession he's talking about. Guaranteed by you.
It's actually, I call it contract bargaining, not a concession, because that's the politically
Okay.
charged piece. And also, you forgot to add in that they're now going to pay almost 5% for 27 years out of their salary every single year.
Only by the Alice in Wonderland standards of pension fund accounting is that seen as a significant concession. But I would suggest another thing. This has been discussed as if we are talking about a stark choice here between what we have, and remember, we're talking about public sector pensions, okay? We're talking about if there's a stark choice here between what we have and the story Susan Lerner told in her op-ed of Uncle Mo. She wrote a very moving op-ed about retirement security, about her mother needing to go into assisted living or a nursing home, and her mother recalling her own uncle, a man, a retired furrier in his 80s, no doubt in the 1930s, who was retired, living in a sixth-floor walk-up, and was penniless and broke and starving, okay? Now, in fact, the choice is not between what we have and Uncle Mo, okay? The choice, remember, as I just told you about, in addition to the pension we discussed, we're talking about a tax-deferred annuity, bargained, as Mike puts it, that had a guaranteed rate of return. You just, in the real world, other people don't get that, okay? That is on top of the plan they already have. A teacher who works for his or her career in the New York City schools and retires at the current peak salary does not retire with a pension of $42,000. He or she retires with a pension of roughly $67,000 if they retire
No.
around the age of 60. Yes?
The annuity is separate. They put that money in
No.
on their own voluntarily. You're absolutely wrong.
Mike, if you have a final average salary of $102,000.
I have the people who administer the pension plan right here. You're absolutely wrong. That is a separate fund. They do that voluntarily. People do it in the private sector and in the public
I think
sector.
I'm talking about just the pension and what you qualify in a pension if you work your whole career and end with a salary of just over $100,000.
You could bring up
If
any
you have
lawyer
30
you want. Legal obligation is the pension. The annuity is based on what they put on
won't argue it.
separately out of their own pocket, which they
I'm
do
actually not including
voluntarily.
that, but I won't get into it then because it's, I mean, you can
You
look at the,
started
you can
with
look
the
at the
Alice
plan
in
document.
Wonderland, and now you're jumping through the looking glass, not me.
Okay. I think you ought to look at your own plan because your plan does
Believe
not
me, I
pay a
do.
pension, does not pay newly retired teachers a pension of $42,000. That's the average for all your retirees now, I believe.
And actually, our pension benefit has actually been moved down. So as people start to retire more and more, the benefit has actually been decreasing.
Well,
So
let's
you know
let
that that
EJ
would
make
bring
his
that
point.
number
We'll agree that it's
right.
somewhere between $42,000 and $67,000.
I think
down.
that.
I'm not agreeing to that.
Well, the reason the average pension may be going down in recent years has to do with early retirements and has to do with retirements of people from newer pension plans. But the fact of the matter is the pension level, which we'll generalize on now because we disagree on specifics, for your members and for other unionized municipal employees in New York City and across the state is far more than anybody in the private sector can hope for. And by the way, we've been talking about a comparison and thinking about a time when more private sector workers were unionized and had defined benefit pensions. The implication is that there was a time when everybody had something like this. Let me make a point to you, okay? What industrial union that you can think of is known as almost synonymous with generous pensions and retirement benefits, fought and even died to get pensions and retirement security for their members? The answer is the UAW. You know what the typical UAW member retires with? He or she retires in his or her late 50s with a pension of $36,000, which is recut in half when that member reaches Social Security retirement age. In fact, a Social Security offset of pensions is quite common, almost universal, insofar as private sector defined benefit pension plans are concerned. It's completely unheard of in the public sector. So the private sector, union private sector defined benefit plans were not at this level either, okay? Secondly, there was a study done recently, an independent study by an analyst outside of New York State. It was featured in the New York Times. New York State public employees can attain an average wage replacement level of 77%, second highest in the country, without counting Social Security. That's not my number. That's a study by an independent academic analyst quite separate from anybody here. You can find all sorts of analyses like that. But again, I don't even harp on the level of the pension because, again, I do think the financial structure is dangerous and has exposed us to risk and volatility. And there is a better alternative, one that I sincerely think Mr. Mulgrew and his members should be willing to consider, which maybe we can turn to next.
Which is?
Well,
Go ahead, but
I mean, you can say the word. Go ahead and say it.
well, defined benefit, defined contribution
Defined
plans.
We'll get to that.
So,
We'll get to that in a
so
second.
I'd just like to try to put some of this into a different perspective. You know, the UAW, I'm actually from Detroit, and I know the UAW's history, and I know a lot about the auto workers and the auto industry. One thing that you know is that most of the members have a high school education, the people that EJ just mentioned. Many of them didn't even graduate from high school, so the fact that their pension is $36,000 has very little to do with what college-educated teachers should be getting as their pensions. It's an unfair comparison, and you should, I think you should reject a comparison like that. It's got nothing to do with what we as the employer of teachers should be paying and expecting our teachers to have in their retirement. We all want the best teachers for our children that we can possibly get, or, you know, within reason, and, you know, you have to pay for it. You can't expect to pay them auto worker retirement.
I have read studies that say that actually the returns on all the defined benefit plans are in fact marginally higher than the returns on the defined contribution plans, taken collectively in this country overall. I've seen those studies. I'm not sure what that proves, but that's a fact. Second of all, in response, you asked for facts, Errol. 78% of all the public employees in this country have a college education, and only 63% of privately employed wage earners have a college education in this country.
That's not even close.
So, what?
That's actually not even close. Only 30% of the U.S. workforce has a 4-year college education.
Maybe
I'm
4-year, 2-year.
I'm
Understood.
absolutely certain of that. It's, you know, it's surprising for an audience like this, but most Americans, you know, the vast majority of Americans in the workforce today
not get a
do
4-year
not have a college education.
You may be talking about some college. The point
Some
being,
college
the
that-
point
that
being,
could be.
public employees tend to be better educated. That, in turn, might be why they get paid more and have better
Just
retirement
out of
benefits.
curiosity, I'm reading from a report that Alyssa Linnell wrote, citing that statistic from the U.S. Bureau of the Census. I just happened to read this report last night.
I'm sorry, you're misreading something because it's, no, absolutely, I mean,
Well,
I
there are two
guarantee,
possibilities,
I
right?
guarantee this.
We understand the point. Who else wanted to get in on this?
You understood that point?
I actually have you know, an interesting statistic about the returns. A study by, I don't know this group actually, Dalbar Inc., looked at a 19-year period from 1984 to 2002 and found that equity mutual fund investors had an average yield of 2.6% on their investments, which was a real return of minus 0.5%. Pension plan returns over that period were 9%.
And this reflects, I'm not saying that that's always going to be the case, but if you think about it, it makes sense that individuals who are not experts managing their own plans are going to do worse than professional fund managers, just on the basis of what kind of returns they're going to get. But when you include the fees that are charged on defined contribution plans, you get a completely different picture. The cost of the same benefit, on average, from a defined benefit plan is about half. It's like 54%. The cost of getting $100,000, let's say, in retirement benefit from a defined benefit plan is about 54% of the cost on average of getting that from a defined contribution plan. And the main reason is all the fees that are charged and for administration of the plan, for legal and accounting, for the costs of the commissions, the trading that goes on. The fees range from a very low of 0.5% to 2.5%, sometimes in rare cases as high as 4%, and they clobber the returns that people get in defined contribution plans. So if your concern is for your retirees to do well and actually have retirement security, you don't want them in defined contribution plans. You want them in defined benefit plans.
Well, I mean, if I could add into that, I mean, when you're talking about two different types of retirement planning, and then you're narrowing it down, or at least in part, that the use of the phrase in order to, because so people will be familiar with, is often described as like 401ks, but 401ks are only one type of vehicle. Many 401ks are poorly designed and costly. I would definitely say that, but that's not a feature. That's a bug, not a feature, as opposed to what goes on in public sector pensions, in which the financial volatility and compounded risk for taxpayers is a feature, not a bug. You can construct defined contribution plans that are efficient and well-balanced. Also, the straw man that you're raising here is that of a defined contribution plan in which all participants are and must be and are encouraged to be active investors and managers of their own money. That's not the best model. In fact, the appropriate model to look at is the large, well-established model that exists in the public sector and has been in the public sector for nearly 50 years. I mean, the New York State and New York City already sponsor the largest defined contribution public sector retirement plan in the country, second only to California. It's through the State University of New York and the City University of New York, 3/4 of whom's unionized professors, most of whom affiliate with the New York State United Teachers, freely choose it.
And how has that done, EJ?
They have an optional retirement program. It's too bad teachers don't have the same option, as a matter of fact. It'd be interesting to see how many of them chose it, since people move in and out of teaching and actually would probably like the flexibility. Well, the way it works is, at the time of your hiring, you choose between being a member of the teacher retirement system or the ERS, which are two defined benefit plans, or you can opt into a insurance annuity plan offered by, on the state level at the State University, 4 different providers. At the City University, it's TIAA-CREF. These plans are quite popular. They've been in existence for almost 50 years. And I really think we could have a good conversation, perhaps not initially, Mike, in public, because you'd have to.
Why not?
Well, I mean, you don't have to negotiate with me, so you can kind of respond to it now. I honestly don't understand why, when I've talked to union people about this, especially teacher union people, why you would oppose, unless I'm wrong and you don't oppose, offering this just to start the conversation as an option to your members.
We would have to look at the overall plan. And the reason that the NYSET is offered to the college professors is because of their mobility at that point. And that's why it was offered at that point in time, because that was the only other option. And they wanted to leave, if they wanted to leave, which the majority of them did do, they wanted to be able to take their funding, their savings, their funds with them. In terms of, I'm always leery when people are pushing for the defined contribution plans because of the the cost of a defined contribution plan. When financial institutions or organizations who are funded by financial institutions are telling me that they want to be able to get their hands on large sums of money, which they then make large sums of money on by constantly moving the money from one place to another, I worry about their motivation.
Excuse me, Mike, financial institutions are not interested in the current defined benefit pension plan?
Oh, yes, they are. But
They're
we
very
have much
interested in
more. We have much more
Some of them
control
love
of it.
it.
And as we know, yes, and as we know, as we have, there's much more control, and we monitor very closely so that people cannot just move funds from one place to another in order to charge fees, because that is how the financial institution actually makes money, is by their fees of managing money. And people would like to make more money. As we know, financial institutions have short terms, they have quarters, they have to constantly drive profits up, and I think we have some pretty clear evidence that they will make some seriously unscrupulous decisions in order to drive profits up. And until we can ensure that those funds would not be put at that type of risk and manipulation and be defrauded in order for someone to have a good quarter, we take care of those things, then we can have discussions.
You know, I really think, I feel compelled to say that the argument that you just heard is a bit attenuated. The collapse that Mike referred to of the value of public pension funds in 2008 was not all attributable to the purchase of mortgage-backed securities, which is what I'm sure Mike was referring to when he talked about what Wall Street had done to the economy. There were decisions by union trustees to invest money in private equity. And it was the collapse of private equity investments to a larger, I'm sorry, you're shaking your head out there. It is true. I don't know about the teachers' pension fund, but I can tell you that the Taft-Hartley funds invested a massive amount. SEIU invested a lot of its pension money in private equity funds, and that was a major reason for the loss in value. Second of all,
Well, we didn't.
I didn't say you
Okay.
did. I
I just
don't
wanted-
have any
wanted
idea
to
what
make
your
it clear.
investments were. But I just want to point out, let's not allocate blame and credit too significantly. Even the public pension funds, I mean, the controller of the state of New York doesn't sit there and decide what those investments are. They employ the same people or hire them as consultants from the financial world to advise them what to do. They have committees from people in the financial world that advise them what to do. Not everybody in the financial world is corrupt, and not all the decisions are bad or self-serving. So let's at least clarify the record in that regard.
Okay.
Let me mention to folks, your green cards, you should be writing down questions. We're going to start taking audience questions in a few minutes. I want to bring up a last sort of a cautionary tale and ask if that indeed is what it is or if it's something we don't need to worry about. Last December, there was a New York Times article about the town of Pritchard, Alabama, which had so many severe financial problems that they actually stopped sending out checks to pensioners. They were legally obligated, so it wasn't a values question. They were legally obligated, indeed, so it wasn't as if the government had any choice in it. They simply didn't have the money. Now, from what you know, not so much only about New York, but also about some of these other horror stories we hear about. We hear horror stories about what might happen in New Jersey. We hear horror stories about what might happen in Illinois, California to a certain extent. Is that something we need to worry about? Is that something that's going to become widespread, or could it be?
That's such a wild case of ineptitude and maybe corruption. I don't know the specifics of it, but no, that's not. I don't think any of us think that that's going to be a widespread problem. No. Just no.
Would our version of that fiscal crisis mean sort of a major and very unpopular tax increase somewhere down the road?
We're actually learning. These plans are not that old, and this is the first 75-year crisis, economic crisis we've been through. There's a learning curve about how to manage these plans. I think one thing that you can agree on looking across the country at the plans that are having the worst problems right now, that are the most underfunded, it's because they made chronically bad decisions about not making contributions to the plans. That Illinois started 30 years ago not making contributions. New Jersey started under Christie Whitman. It continued. Corzine was nearly as bad as his predecessors in failing to make the contributions. So if you have bad management of the plans, yeah, you will have problems. But as taxpayers and as citizens, we need to make sure that our government officials actually make the contributions that the actuaries are telling them to make. It doesn't matter what discount rate you choose if when you're told that you have to make X contribution, you make half X. You're going to get into trouble.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. Illinois and New Jersey are the most egregious offenders of that, and it's a very serious problem. They exercised a political choice because there was no statutory mandate that they make the contributions that they were actuarially supposed to make. But I have to tell you, New York State started down the slippery slope last year by agreeing to borrow, in effect, have the state borrow from the pension fund. They called it. They used a nice felicitous language called pension smoothing or pension amortization, but in effect, it was a loan from the pension fund to the state to make the contribution that they were statutorily required to make. That is a grievous injustice to the retirees of the state. And there is a move by I won't mention names, to do the same thing, not for the teachers in the city of New York, but the 650 school districts in the state, to enable them to defer their obligation this year to their pension fund to the New York State teachers' retirement system, and let them spread it out over 15 years, and that is morally indistinguishable from what New Jersey and Illinois has done.
On this issue, one thing that I hope comes out of the conversations that have started over the last 2 years on pensions is a little bit more awareness about how these policies and these political decisions really have ramifications. And you have to be, one thing is for sure, it only works if you're following what your obligations are. And people have made decisions to say, the actuaries are telling us this is what we have to do at this moment, and now we're not going to do it because politically nobody's watching and I don't really care. And it makes it easier for me to do something else. You can't have that. The systems don't work with that. And that irresponsibility or ineptitude it just can't, it is something that every state needs to be very careful of, because it's just wrong and it's just going to get a lot of people in trouble. And in the end, it's not just the current taxpayers that are going to have to deal with it. The people will not be able to have retirement security as they thought they would. And that is the worst case scenario.
Isn't the flip side of that, or at least what I've read, is the flip side of that, sort of in the dark of night in Albany, a couple of lines will be changed in a piece of legislation that nobody's really tracking to give a pension sweetener to an organization or a category of employees, imposing a future cost that maybe was calculated, maybe wasn't, certainly isn't broadly known, and may not even be fully understood by the members of the legislature. Do we, going back to this institutional question I asked before, do we have ways of making sure we at least agree on what the future obligation is going to be?
At present, no, and what you described is exactly what has transpired, not just in New York, but in virtually every state over repeated cycles. It's interesting, I strongly agree. This is actually, in terms of its lifespan, we're still new at this. This defined benefit, the maturity of defined benefit pension plans, we're only in the first era. I mean, you're basically looking at once state and local governments began their really big hiring expansions in the 1960s, then these pension plans began to expand significantly, and they only began to invest heavily in equities in the 1980s. They're quite different now than what they were then.
And they started off unfunded.
They started out completely unfunded, and New York City has never been fully funded in some ways. And so what happens is there's a moral hazard at the heart of this current system also, because it's extremely complex. To make it work the way it can work best in the opinion of those who are most fond of it, it's extremely complicated. It defies easy understanding. It's hard to get lawmakers to understand anything anyway, but if you confront elected officials who have a time horizon of 2 to 4 years with the ability to make decisions that have massive, potentially massive out-year consequences that will save a little money now and gratify some important political group, they will do it again and again and again and again, especially since, in my experience, it's virtually impossible to explain the financing and actuarial concepts behind these systems to anyone. Any normal person, including
I understand your stuff, so I
lawmakers.
think anybody can.
Well, you know, but I mean, I don't think they can. I mean, well, congratulations, but I mean, they don't understand it. They repeatedly, this is the other thing that always happens, that as soon as there seems to be some relaxation or relief, there's pressure to restore benefits that were changed. There's even a name for it in Albany that appears in all the bill memos from all the different union groups. It's called tier equity. We want this tier to be the same as that tier. And that's what happens.
I think there's an important counterexample that people here especially ought to be aware of, which is, you know, this is the city that owes its police and firefighters more than any other probably, you know, after 9/11. And yet, the city looked at what had been promised and realized that police and firefighters had been overpromised, that their pensions were too rich. And they were cut back. I don't know the details of this. I only really learned about it reading the comptroller's report, this very recent report, Sustainable or Not. But the costs for police and firefighter pensions have been cut, I think, almost in half over the long term, which is, you know, the perfect counterexample. Yes, you have the time, in fact, with long horizons to make adjustments. When you see that you've overpromised, you can make changes. You can cut back, despite the constitutional protections. You don't have to cut. I mean, you can cut back for new employees, so that they don't get the same rich benefits, perhaps, that people have had before. So.
Okay. I'm going to start with questions now, and I want to thank everybody who supplied them. Since the unions negotiate with the people they elect, how can we claim that we have a fair negotiation? Very basic question of
Is that for me?
you probably have an opinion on it.
Look, we support political candidates, but let's be clear. I mean, this idea that we own people is just absurd. I'm sorry. Hey, you can read the Post and the news all you want. We will talk to people. We will go and have a discussion about what the facts are on a certain issue. We get accused of this all of the time, and I can tell you this: we go to Albany with the City of New York on any of our pension changes. They're agreed upon here with the City of New York. We go together to lobby on them. That is the United Federation of Teachers. Okay? So it is always with agreement with the city when we go to Albany. And there are people who are saying, at one point, these pensions were negotiated just with the city, and the city was in control of it. That's where things really became political, and that's why it was sent up to, and I think Dick was in the middle of this when this change happened, that's why it was sent to Albany to take it out of the local politics.
This is a question for E.J. McMahon and everyone. I'm under the impression Social Security was designed and has been used to supplement other forms of retirement security. Can you speak to the idea of it now or in the future as a full pension plan?
Well, I don't think anybody regards Social Security as a full pension plan, but I would observe that when it was created as the primary pension for people at the time it was created. For that reason, public employees were not in Social Security for decades. And in fact, in about a dozen states today, they're still not members of Social Security. People who work under Railway Act pensions are not. It was for the pension for people who didn't have any. It remains the safety net pension to ensure that nobody's in the situation of Uncle Mo. So we do have a national pension plan. It's Social Security. Is Social Security A, adequate, B, adequately funded? No and no. It's not as inadequately funded as public pensions, but it has problems in the long-term future that need to be addressed. So I would not, it was not supplementary. It was meant to be the primary pension at a time when people had no old age income and also when they were not living as long.
A question for Dick Ravitch. Can you speak more to the potential legal questions for the courts if they violate their legal contracts, presumably on fully funding pensions and making those payments?
Well, as I said, I have my own personal value system is that these obligations have to be met. I can't comment ultimately, but I can tell you that I've seen memorandum from perfectly responsible law firms that suggest that the promise to pay benefits is the promise of the pension fund itself and not of the state or the city. I've seen arguments made that you can modify benefits midway in somebody's term of employment, that whatever benefits, retirement benefits they accrued for the first X years of their public employment, you can't change those, but you could change the benefits subsequently. And all I suggested was they were going to be litigated. I'm of the old-fashioned view that if the intention was to make an enforceable promise, you should keep it. That's, in some people's view, an old-fashioned concept. But let me say that obviously, put this in perspective, yes, I believe the unions have had a tremendous impact on politics, but I think Mike was saying is that all the politicians don't stay bored all the time.
Mike was not saying that. Let's be clear here.
Number two.
Dick Ravitch said it.
I'm just joking. But more importantly, I think it's important to recognize, in fairness, that the changes, that if they were that powerful, then they did not succeed in preventing the creation of different pension tiers when we were in trouble in the mid-'70s, nor did they succeed or even fight the creation of a new pension tier at the state level last year. So I think, to me, part of the problem today is not that people don't act responsibly, Errol, when they're confronted with harsh realities. We have always done that in this society. That's been the saving grace in the United States. I think the problem today is that people do not treat the economic and fiscal circumstances that we, in fact, are facing with a level of gravitas that it deserves. And that is partially due to the, if you'll forgive me, the inadequate reporting of what happens in state government. State governments function in cocoons, and the media is much more interested in talking about the politics rather than the substance of what goes on, and therefore you have a generally underinformed public. And second of all, people understand, union leaders and others, everybody understands that when you confront a limitation of accessibility to cash, and we're getting there slowly in this city, in this state, and in this country, that you got to make a decision between taxes or cutting benefits. And we for 20 years have been trying to do both, to cut taxes and increase benefits, and we can't afford it anymore. And that reality just too late, unfortunately, but is just beginning to sink in. And I believe that to the extent the union movement has smart leaders, that they will participate in that discourse, and I hope everybody else will as well.
Can I Yeah, when Dick mentioned about the different tiers being formed, I would point out, getting back to your previous question, Errol, about in Albany, the syndrome where people come and lobby and at the end of session get sweeteners done. Each of those tiers the tier reforms was largely undone before anybody got close to retiring. That's one reason why it was easy to agree to them. Tier 3 was undone by Tier 4. The so-called Tier 5 reforms done by the state in December '09 essentially restored the status quo ante of Tier 4, which had been sweetened over the intervening 16 years before anybody got close to retiring under that plan. That's the syndrome. In other words, if you're in a union, it's not too hard to agree to a certain amount of changes in a new pension tier for newly hired members when you're fully aware, based on historical experience, that none of those members are going to be approaching retirement age for a couple of decades, at least. They won't even be thinking about it. And that you have all that time to claw back what you just gave away, which has been done repeatedly. I mean, the police pension change was a fluke. It was a result of an unexpected veto by Governor Patterson of an extension of the old pension plan, and pursuant to what Errol was talking about, hold off. It hasn't stuck yet, okay? They've barely hired anybody in that new plan. They've got 20 years to undo it, and believe me, that's what they're intent on doing. So that's the problem with these plans. And when the changes are made in the dark of night at the end of session, nobody understands what it is they're even doing, and they certainly don't account accurately for the potential costs of what they're doing, in part because those costs aren't even knowable, much less measured accurately. That's the problem.
Here's a question from Jim Parrott, the Fiscal Policy Institute. Should the Martin Act be changed to allow pension funds to sue financial advisors for fraud? It's a question that came up a little earlier.
Yes.
The question was actually directed to Dick Ravitch. I'd like him to make sure we get him in a response.
I've never thought about the issue, but I can't imagine why somebody should be relieved of liability for fraud, but I'm not familiar with the existing law in this such. So I think if somebody acted fraudulently, they should have liability, absolutely. But I don't know what you're referring to there.
In New York State is one of two states where only in New York State only the Attorney General can go after fraud, money that was lost because of fraudulent acts.
I see.
The United Federation of Teachers, we cannot go after the financial institutions who committed fraud, and we lost money on that. So what has come about now is the irony of all of what happened in 2008 was that the taxpayers of this state and the country bailed out the financial institutions. And our pension plans lost billions of dollars. Now we know that a lot of that money was lost because of fraud, and now the taxpayers of the city and state are being told they have to contribute more to make up for these losses that happened, when we already bailed out the institutions who caused it, and now we don't have a legal recourse to go after them, and it shouldn't be the taxpayers paying for it. It should be the institutions that caused those losses. And that's what we're talking about when we deal with the Martin Act.
Well, I've heard you say this before, Michael, and what I don't understand is in your dealings, before you turned over millions or even billions of dollars to a financial advisor or an investment company, there's nothing in the contract that says you have some recourse if they screw you?
It doesn't work that way.
Screw you is not a legal term.
Remember? Yes. Judge, they screwed us. Good luck with that.
Well, no, I mean dispute resolution. Call it whatever you want.
The laws of the state do not allow it. The laws of the state do not allow it. The Attorney General is the only individual who has the power to do it. And every time we bring it up, we have had bills put into legislation that say, I agree with EJ at times. Why should the taxpayers be paying for this burden when it was caused because of fraud? So why don't you just let us go after the institutions and get the funding back? Because we now know that they got the money back, they got their bailout, and they're doing very well, which is fine, good for them. But can we have the money you defrauded from us back, please?
Well, I really think I have to say, as I said earlier, to suggest, Mike, that the losses incurred were a function of fraud is really grossly overstating the fact.
Well, some were, and those would be the ones we
Well,
would be more than happy to go into court and have a debate about, and put that before a judge and jury.
If you read about the fiscal collapse in 2008, there are a lot of things responsible for it, primarily the eagerness of this society from top to bottom to make mortgage loans available to people who couldn't afford to pay the interest on those mortgages. So
Yep.
it's a little more complicated than just fraud.
Here's a loaded question. What is the possibility of reducing the benefits of already retired public employees? Fiscal hawks in the audience here.
Well, on public pensions, the answer is there is none. And I would actually agree there should be none for somebody who's already retired. I certainly have, I don't know anybody who suggested that you should. Well, the mayor has suggested going after the so-called bonus supplemental payment that police and firefighters get, including, as I didn't understand correctly when he first announced it, people who already get it, who are retired. Now, that is reachable if you haven't retired yet under law. It's not protected by the Constitution, but I think it's a matter of fairness, of honest, adhering to contracts, and frankly, also where we stand financially and what we need to do. We don't need to go after something that, in terms of pension benefits, I don't think it would be right, and I don't think we need to touch any pension benefits somebody has, and constitutionally, we can't.
Here's a question about maybe for a future panel. The city has $80 billion. I can't vouch for the number. This is the question. The city has $80 billion in largely unfunded post-employment health care benefits, about 4% funded. Should we start funding these on an accrual basis? Is it a crisis waiting to happen?
I'm going to let Mike answer that.
Gee, thanks, Dick. I'm not sure. That is something I have to go look at.
Okay, a warning for us all,
Well,
journalists
I mean,
included.
I would suggest you do look at it
I will.
because
Believe me, I will.
The city is balanced, right now, the city is what accountants call balance sheet insolvent. You can go to the page in the comprehensive financial report. The city owes more than it owns, to the tune of about $100 billion. And the principal reason for that is the really completely, in fact, completely unfunded retiree health care obligation the city has. Now, interestingly, and I bring up your name in this, I hope you don't mind, Mike, when I explain it to people
It's all right.
in a way that you wouldn't mind. When I talk to people who are looking at the city's financial condition or even rating it and say, and the reason New York City, by the way, shows up this badly is because unlike any other large state or municipality, it's actually more honest in its accounting of this. It doesn't pretend that it's ever going to be, advertising it. It simply says, we've got this obligation, we have no plans to pay it. And that's the case with most places. And
The state of New York has a health care obligation, the present value of which is about $56 billion, that is not funded either.
Right. I mean, it's statewide, it's over 200. But when I say to people, when I ask financial analysts on Wall Street and people involved in rating, and I say, now, when you look at the city of New York with all of the good and bad and in between, and you see that it's balance sheet insolvent, okay, and the city is that far out. What do and there's that $80 billion unfunded liability for OPEB. You look at that, and what do you say? And I got this answer from several guys. Well, they're not going to really pay that. They don't have to pay that. And I always say, have you discussed that with Mike Mulgrew? Okay, have you informed Mike Mulgrew of that? I always just not to take your name in vain, or I
appreciate it actually.
Because in fact, that is not actually a sustainable obligation, and that's something that does need to be looked at and needs to be changed.
What I do know is, look, in New York City, all health care is negotiated through the MLC. It's not done individually.
Municipal Labor Council.
Municipal Labor Council, excuse me, I did a bad thing. And that's a council of all the unions together, the municipal unions. 2 years ago, city came to us, we changed a whole bunch of things, and that's a recurring savings to the city right now of $257 million. So in terms of this issue, once again, it's always in our interest to make sure that the city we are in is thriving. We do not want to put the city, I hate to bring up another city, but I'm not going to bring up another city, but we know of cities where they have just driven themselves right off the cliff. And that's just irresponsible. And one thing I could say is people in this city are constantly trying to look at where do we maintain that balance. We do want a city that thrives and works for everyone, and the municipal workforce needs a city to be growing and thriving, unless then there will be a diminishment of municipal workforce.
You know, I'm surprised Mike didn't point out that a large part of the health care obligations the city has is to pay the health care of retired cops, firemen, and sanitation men between the date of their retirement and when they become 65 and are eligible for Medicare. Teachers do not benefit by in the same way. I thought I'd point that out since you didn't.
I appreciate that you pointed it out.
Okay, folks, we are at the end of our time. I want to thank all of you. I learned a lot. I was taking notes. I hope you all did too. Ross Eisenbrey, E.J. McMahon, Michael Mulgrew, and Dick Ravitch.